Hey everyone, it's your buddy and pal Karnak, Serenity Wargaming and Explanations. We're going to look at Tri-Fighters today for the Separatist. So the droid Tri-Fighter Squadron, it is, how can you tell it's for Separatists? Well, to the left of their name, you'll see the faction icon there. Bottom left-hand corner is the fighter icon. Opposite corner is its point cost, 11 points. Below the name, you'll see a bar there with some numbers and dice icons going from left to right. You'll see that this squadron can move up to distance 5. It has 3 hull points. It has an anti-squadron armament of 1 red die and 2 blue die, and an anti-ship armament of 1 black die. The squadron gets 3 keywords, so it's very similar to the TIE interceptors for the Empire. It gets counter 2, it has swarm, but a bonus that the squadron gets is that, if you activate it with a squadron command, you're able to add an additional die into the attack pool of a color that's in the attack pool. So AI anti-squadron 1 means that if you're attacking a squadron, you roll your red die, your 2 blue die, and then after you roll that, you can then decide, okay, I want to add either another red die or I want to add in another blue die. And that is how Anti-Squadron 1 works, the AI things. Again, you can only add that die if activated by a squadron command. It won't work, or unless you're using something like the hypersonic beacon or something like that. There's one or two other like maybe minor ways you can get the AI portion of the card to resolve, but by and large, it's only done if you're activated by a squadron command or something that very explicitly tells you otherwise. Okay, just have to make sure I'm being clear on that. Counter 2, of course, works that if something attacks your squadron, you can counter back with 2 dice unless that is an attack from a ship, or it's a snipe attack, or for any other reason, a card upgrade or something explicitly states that like you can't attack them back. How swarm works is that if you have another one of your friendly squadrons engaged with whatever it is that you're shooting at, you can then re-roll a die. Important distinction again is that you have to be engaged with them to get that swarm benefit. Okay, tri-fighters. So some people think they're great, some people don't. I personally feel like that they are as good, if not better, than TIE interceptors for the Empire. The biggest reason for that is the anti ship armament. 1 black die, 75% chance of damage whenever you roll that sucker. I feel like that's very good in that regard. They are, again, fast at speed 5. Their hull value, same thing like Empire, is that they're just very low hull value, and they just cannot stand being flaked. They do not like being flaked, but they are there to attack other fighters and try to get them wiped out of the way. The argument about potentially why some people do not like them over TIE interceptors is, again, they have a red die and 2 blue die for their initial pool. Empire, it's 4 blue dice for those TIE interceptors. So again, pros and cons. You can argue that, with the anti-squadron armament, if you wanted to add that in as a blue die, then it's 3 blue die and a red die. But some folks are like, well, that red die doesn't seem worth the trade-off for having better bombing power. But I think that there's arguments for both, in that, you could roll that double damage on that red die, which, can surprise your opponents. It does have, it's got 2 blanks, it's got a critical symbol or 2 on there. That it cannot be very helpful. So it's kind of like a wash. By and large, whenever I'm attacking with tri-fighters, I'm almost always rolling in a blue die because I almost always will need my swarm to re-roll the red die. And even then, the red die doesn't seem like it wants to behave and it comes up blank. So I can see where that argument comes into place about why they don't prefer them over the TIE interceptors. They both have strengths and weaknesses. Very, very minor changes, though. Ultimately, I still think they're good because, again, of that black die. And by and large, if you're going to be running tri fighters, you typically are wanting to throw them with like flight controllers, or if you're bringing a small screen, then that doesn't matter anyway. You're wanting to bring, like the hero aces, like DIS T81 or Aphelic, Afarak prototypes. I just call that Aflac. It's the Aflac Tri-Fighter. But Tri-Fighters, again, just with Separatists, it really comes down to like, what are you trying to build for? What are you trying to accomplish? Are you going for some kind of like invisible hand, like a whole bunch of stuff in your face? Are you trying to like build a screen? Are you trying to build like a squadron killer with your squadrons? Um, just like what I say a lot with the Separatists and Republic, it's like you're not wanting to like bring like 8 of these squadrons all by themselves. It really is these factions really like mix and maxing, bringing like 2 or 4. Yeah, I could see bringing like 6 tri-fighters, just like sometimes you can do with Imperials. The issue with the Separatists is that they suffer from not having a large variety of aces to bring along compared to Empire, which is like you can kind of like really build, a varying degree of different squadron balls depending on what you're trying to accomplish. And Separatists don't quite have that. But moving on, that's the droid tri-fighter. Let's talk about the first and simplest of the unique squadrons, which how can you tell if they're unique? Well, in front of their unique name, which is for this one, it's DIS T81. You'll see a little dot or bullet point, signifies they are unique. You can only ever have one of them. This squadron is 17 points. It is a brace scatter ace, pretty common. The unique bar changes on them is that they lose a blue die for anti-squadron, but gain a black die. So they get a red, blue, black. Their anti-ship is still black. I love the anti-squadron dice variety for this squadron. I think it's just really good. When you have swarm, you almost always just only need to reroll that red die is what you have to worry about. But this squadron picks up something special. So not only is it getting the anti-squadron 1 and the counter 2 and the swarm like a typical droid tri-fighter, it gets snipe 3, meaning that it can throw 3 blue die with snipe, which makes it all the more potent because its card effect is your attacks cannot be obstructed. So your attacks cannot be obstructed, cannot be stopped. It doesn't matter if they get obstruction. Like, for example, I've had some players try to say, oh, well, Sienna Re is still obstructed. I'm like, nope, that's not what that says. Sienna Re is like it's obstructed, but DIS overrides that because its attacks also, it cannot be obstructed. So Sienna is like the attack gets the obstructed qualifier, but DIS overrides that because it simply cannot be obstructed, period. So that's why DIS is able to attack anything, and there's no obstruction penalty ever for them unless something specifically goes in and says like the attack is obstructed, even if an attack says it cannot be obstructed, or something very explicit spelled out like that, which there's nothing in the game like that at all. So DIS is just, if you're bringing tri-fighters, why is your first tri-fighter not the squadron? Is always the argument I'm going to make, because for 6 more points you get in the scatter. It has snipe. It's a fantastic squadron all around. So DIS can't go wrong. Let's move on to the next droid tri-fighter ace. We have the Aflac prototypes. Again, I just call them Aflac just because it's funny. Again, it has a little dot or bullet point in front of them, signifies they are unique. They have largely all the same stats. Again, they've got that red, blue, black for anti-squadron. This one, though, is 19 points. It's a bit more pricey. And this one, again, all the same keywords as the tri-fighter. Its card effect reads, after an enemy squadron ends its activation at distance 1, that squadron suffers 1 damage. In a nutshell, how does this work? Okay, did an enemy squadron move itself into range to attack like either Aflac or something else, and it happens to end at distance 1 of Aflac? Okay, it's going to take a damage. Or in a reverse situation, say you take Aflac and you chuck them into the middle of an enemy squadron ball, and all those squadrons are unactivated. As they go to activate, if Aflac is still alive by the end of their activation, then yeah, they're going to take a damage. But it's a little bit at odds with itself, because you want to get mileage out of that activation or out of the card ability where it deals damage to other squadrons that are activating. But at the same time, with CIS not having escort, this squadron just gets focused down so quickly that it's almost like why did I even bother bringing the squadron? So you still have to be a little selective about where you're placing this guy because you don't want them to get chucked in and immediately get blown up and you lose that value. In some situations, it's kind of like that's what you have to do. But if you're cagey about it, if you like, for example, say you made a couple attacks at a couple different squadrons, and let's say that there's one that only has one health left, it's unactivated. Well, I would move Aflac in range of like maybe trying to attack another squadron, but leave it at distance one of the other one, and hopefully it can't like move away or something. And that way, yes, even if it activates and shoots Aflac, as long as it's not killing Aflac, it's going to auto destruct and blow itself up. But again, it comes back to like, well, you have counter anyway. So, if something's shooting you, you're countering it back. It's just like, I don't know. I never been able to get the squadron to ever work as effectively as I would prefer. It's great if you're chucking it into the middle of a bunch of bombers, right? But eventually, even that they can still get plinked down. So, pros and cons to everything. They do have one clarification, which reads does the ability resolve when an Exogorf, or if you want to say Dutch Vander, toggles the squadron's activation slider? The argument here being like, well, you push the slider and that's them activating. And no, that is not what the rulebook says. When you are toggling the slider, that's toggling it. You're toggling it from activated to activation. It is entirely skipping over the fact that it's not actually activating to do it. So when you're toggling the slider back and forth, that's not going to resolve this squadron's ability to peg that for damage. So nope, toggling is not the same thing as activation. I want to make sure that was being reviewed and mentioned. So I had somebody who had this squadron in the middle of a bunch of squadrons, and they were using something like what's that black critical card here? Let me see here. I'll just use this as an example. Somebody was using the flechette torpedoes. So again, if you're using a black die, if you have an icon, you can spend that die to toggle something's activation. And so they're saying, oh, I was able to flak and have a black die and toggle, the squadron. So they're all going to take damage from Aflac. And it's like, nope, unfortunately, that's because they're not ending in activation because they never had an activation. It's just the toggle got flipped from either one state to another. There was no activation that was accomplished during that. Okay, that's Tri Fighters. I don't really have a whole lot to like super dive into. I really like taking them myself. In almost all of my lists, you're going to see some form of Tri Fighters in there. Usually just the two heroes. Again, just because having a hero with scatter is just their survivability still just goes way up. Or I'll bring like Dis and I'll bring like 3 other regular droid tri-fighters. And I feel like that's still like a pretty good screening force, especially if you're bringing something like reserve hangar decks over here, which a lot of CIS ships are able to bring the offensive retrofit. So you usually can have the reserve hangar decks tagging along as well, which you then just get just so much value out of these tri-fighters. Okay. Well, appreciate you watching and leave some comments about where do you like using some of these aces or these squadron combinations, and I'll catch you next time.